And welcome to September 2020's Community Grand Rounds. To start off rounds for us this month, I'd like to introduce Mary Jo Gregory, President and CEO of the NARVA Institute, the organization that's hosting and leading the development of these rounds. Mary Jo?
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining. We're delighted to be able to support Community Grand Rounds. And today it is my privilege to reintroduce to you, many of you already know Dr. Thomas Joyner from his time here in Arizona when he came and presented at our symposium a couple years ago. But to remind you all, Dr. Thomas Joyner is an academic psychologist and leading expert on suicide. He is the Robert O. Lawton Professor of Psychology at Florida State University, where he operates his laboratory for the study of psychology and neurobiology of mood disorders, suicide, and related conditions. Dr. Joyner is also the author of many books, Why People Die of Suicide, Myths About Suicide, and he's also the current editor-in-chief of the Suicide and Life-Threatening Behavior, a nationally recognized journal. Dr. Joyner has done a lot of work in this area, is an international speaker, renowned expert, and was going to present to us today about suicide risk in uncertain times. And I think you will find everything that he has to say very, very connected to all the work that we do. So thank you for joining, and Dr. Joyner, thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm very happy to be with you today, and thank you so much, Mary Jo, and everyone for inviting me. And I'm looking forward to the next hour of presenting some of my ideas about suicide risk and also some discussion, question and answer with you all. Just a technical note, if anything's going wrong, all I can see are my slides. So Mary Jo or Mark or Jen, I'm going to count on you all to intervene as needed. Just let me know if there's a problem with the sound or the slides or anything like that.
We will do that, Dr. Joyner, and if I just may let attendees know too, if you have any questions during Dr. Joyner's presentation, please use the Q&A, and then we will share them with Dr. Joyner either at an appropriate break during his presentation or at the end. There'll be time for questions and answers. But Dr. Joyner, you're framed up nicely, look great. So thank you, sir.
I appreciate that. Okay, well, let's forge ahead then. I thought one timely starting place might be obviously what's going on now, and viewing it or really asking the question, is there, along with this pandemic, a mental health storm that has been brewed up by this pandemic? Is there a storm? What's the nature of that storm? And are there ports in the storm? That's kind of where I'm going to start. I thought it made sense to do that. In terms of the storm, it's been brewing for a long time in the United States. This next slide goes all the way back to 1990, if you can see down there at the bottom of on the left there, and then all the way on through to more recent times, 2017. And if you were to continue this slide forward to 2018 and 2019, unfortunately, that blue line keeps ticking up, trending upward. Now, as you can see, the max point, at least on this graph, is 50,000 over there to the left top of the screen. By 2019, we had not quite gotten there, but 2020, we'll see. It's possible that we'll have 50,000 of our fellow Americans die by suicide this year. So this is part of the brewing storm that has been a part of the landscape in the US now for many years. And it's led to a lot of discussion and a lot of angst and worry and very good work as well. A large measure, though, of the angst has been along the lines of what we're doing is not working. We need to change course altogether. We don't know what we're doing. The people who are currently so-called experts don't know anything, those kinds of narratives. And perhaps there's some merit to those kinds of thoughts, but I don't think there's great merit to them, because if you widen the scale or the scope to the entire world, you see a different picture. And this picture is more or less same time frame as the previous slides, but now we're talking about international rates around the entire globe. And it's a very different trend, a decrease, a pretty noticeable decrease actually, especially in some countries. This is the reality worldwide, and this reality here does not jive very well with the idea of we're not doing anything right, the experts don't know anything. That kind of narrative doesn't fit this trend. And this is the world trend. What it does fit a little bit better, I'm going to go back to the previous slide now, is this trend that's in the US. And what the difference between this image, the US rates, and then I'm going to go back to the international rates, and this image, the difference really begs the question. What is it that's relatively unique about the United States that is making our trends look so different from the rest of the world? That's an interesting question, and actually there's no definitive answer yet. I'm going to go back to the US rates while I talk about this. But there are some very likely candidates that are driving these rates up despite our efforts that are working in the rest of the world. Some things that we in the US have to contend with as complicating factors that much of the rest of the world does not have to contend with. And I would point to at least two things, starting with the opioid crisis. It's pretty acute, as many of you will know, here in the United States, more so than it is in much of the rest of the world. Now, obviously, opioids can be used in a suicide on purpose, that occurs, but maybe even more regularly than that, opioid misuse, especially a lifestyle, at least in part devoted to opioid misuse, can spur a trajectory towards demoralization, disconnection, all sorts of other problems, which in turn spur suicide risk. So in multiple ways, opioids are not helpful, and yet we have a little bit of a problem with that the rest of the world doesn't have as much of. The opioid crisis makes we who are trying to bend this curve downward, we're swimming upstream against that crisis, whereas the rest of the world's not as much. Similarly, the United States has, for better or worse, and I really do think there are better and worse elements of this, the United States has a unique cultural relationship to violence. The reason I say it's both better and worse is there's an aspect of this related to rugged individualism. And there's admirable qualities to rugged individualism. I honestly believe that personally, very much so. I also acknowledge that it's got a downside. It's got a little bit of a dark side. If you get too rugged, if you get too individualistic, those are actually two different risk processes. Being too rugged, too violent, being too alone, too lonely, those are dangerous risk processes. And when they come together in the same person, as we'll see shortly, that can be a danger. So there are some things about the American landscape that I think make us in suicide prevention in the US swim upstream. Despite that, I think there's really promising and interesting work going on. And you can see that as reflected in the global rates that I showed you a moment ago. Now, so this, back to the US rates, this is the storm. And it's been going on for a while, as you can see here. The question, of course, becomes, has this storm intensified in the last 6 to 7 months that we've been under this condition of pandemic? And I wanted to turn to that question and reflect on it for a few minutes. First off, we don't know for sure yet about the ultimate outcome, the one that's depicted on this slide, namely death rates by suicide. We don't have those data yet. There's some reasons for concern. There are some other areas where the reports are less concerning. And my take on that reality is right now we just don't know what the effect is yet on the suicide death rate. But we are getting some glimpses on things related to that, like the depression rate, the anxiety rate, and the rate of suicidal ideation. If you look at the US population as a whole, for example, as evaluated in census snapshots, the US Census, everybody will know generally what they do every 10 years, but they also do every week or month a lot of kind of snapshots of what's going on with the US population, including things related to mental health. And so they had snapshots of depression rates, anxiety rates, things like that in 2018 and 2019, and then recently in 2020. And not surprisingly, the 2018, 2019 rates of depression and anxiety were pretty similar to one another. That is in the spring and summer of 2018 and 2019, and then they shot up in the spring and summer of 2020 by a factor of at least 2. So at least twice the amount of depression and anxiety under pandemic as the year previous, same time frame, but the year previous and 2 years previous. So that's the storm that we are contending with, and there's pretty wide consensus that that's a real signal, that that's a true finding, a true effect. We just don't know yet whether that's going to translate over into suicide death rates. There are reasons to worry about that. Social distancing can mean social isolation. Social isolation, very well characterized risk factor for suicide death. In the US, people are buying more guns. The last several months have seen record sales of guns. In the US, half of suicides, 50%, 51, 52% in some studies, are enacted with a firearm. So more weapons combined with things like worry and stress and economic pressure and loneliness. That's a concerning combination, no question about it. Alcohol purchases have skyrocketed too. And so you throw that into the mix and there's reason for concern. I would counter that reason for concern a little bit with the fact that these kinds of crises have surprising sort of paradoxical effects sometimes, in that people can rally together, they can pull together. And if people do that, that actually tends to suppress the suicide rates. And I would add that another potential pandemic-related protective factor would be that people value their health more under pandemic conditions. They may even value life itself more under pandemic conditions. And if they do, well, then those things may offset any risk that is increased by things like loneliness and stress and economic loss and the like. So I think it's a little bit of an open question about what the effects of this are going to be. But one thing we know is that there is a storm, population level, at least with regard to indicators like depression and anxiety. And we also know that there are ports in that larger storm. In other words, areas of subpopulations within the larger populations who actually are protected, relatively speaking. And I would point to 3 examples that I think are interesting and that I happen to know about, that I think are relatively generalizable to some other settings at any rate. The first has to do with university students. I'm at Florida State University. It's a large state university. We started this semester in 2020 in January, 40,000 plus students on the campus. And then of course in March, everything changed and went to online. That transition of course was worrisome. And yet we have a way of tracking, much as the census tracks the US population. We at the Department of Psychology in Florida State have a way of tracking our undergraduate students in a very similar way. So we know what their symptom levels are months to months to month. And it turns out there was not a surge among our students who remained engaged via online to the university. There's an effect of sustained engagement in whatever it is that you were doing pre-pandemic, even if it's a transition to online, that appears to have at least somewhat of a mitigating effect. We saw the exact same thing at the clinic, the psychotherapy clinic that I run on campus. We had to transition, of course, like many of you, I'm sure, everything to telehealth. That transition, in some cases, is pretty rocky, but in most cases went great. We had great continuation and sustained engagement. And those patients, despite being selective for high suicide risk, most of them actually saw a decrease in their suicide risk indicators as the pandemic progressed, because they had the buffer, we think, of ongoing weekly psychotherapeutic engagement. And last, there's evidence done by other research groups that locates the overall storm that you see depicted on this kind of image on the screen, locates that storm in larger cities. And by contrast, much of the rural US seems to be, relatively speaking, sheltered from this storm. Rural America, maybe a port in a storm as engagement with a university, engagement with a psychotherapist can be a port in the larger storm. I see that my internet connection is shaky a little bit. I'm going to get off the share screen there and just check in. Technology working okay?
Technology's going okay. Yep.
Okay.
We can see you well and hear you well. Thank you.
Great. All right, great. Let me get back into share screen. There we go. All right. I thought it might be also timely to look into, I'm trying to advance my slides here, that's not working. Let me try something here. Give me a second while I sort this out, please.
Sure, absolutely. And while that's being sorted out, just let folks know that if you have questions, there have been a couple already. We will share them with Dr. Joyner at the appropriate time during either the presentation or at the conclusion of it. And I know we're all used to dealing with we'll call them the gremlins of the electronic world when we're doing, when we're using the internet these days. So I appreciate everyone's patience.
Me too, and I think I'm back on to the slide that I wanted to use. I thought it might also be timely to look into the US rates per demographic variables like gender and ethnicity and race. And this slide depicts the rates in women, females in the United States. Blue bars, 1999, about 20 years ago. And then green bars, more or less recent days. That's the way this is set up. Deaths per 100,000 on the up and down axis. And across the bottom, first you have all people together, the whole US, in terms of just the females on this slide. And then different ethnicities and race, white, black, API. API stands for Asian Pacific Islander, AIAN, American Indian, Alaska Native, and then Hispanic along the bottom. And across these different groups, basically you can see the green bars are bigger than the blue bars, meaning over the last 20 years, we've seen an increase. I already showed you those data. But what you could also see here is that most of that increase, a lot of it, is really driven by two particular groups: American Indian, Alaska Native, and white people in the US. And the other groups have also seen increases. That's important to acknowledge and important to understand and intervene on. But those increases are somewhat moderate as compared to the situation in those other two groups. Incidentally, all of this is taken from the CDC, the numbers, the categories, all of it directly from the Centers for Disease Control. So this is in women. What we're going to see next is the same exact setup in men. And you'll notice a very similar slide, except the numbers are a lot bigger. Just because in men, suicide death rates are 3 to 4 times what they are in women. So let's go to that next slide. Here it is. You can see the numbers are higher because male suicide mortality is so much more pronounced than female suicide mortality. But here it's the same story. Green bars are bigger than the blue bars. Most of it driven by those two same ethnic groups. We've got increases in the other groups, to be sure, and we need to understand those and do better with those. But most of this increase is driven by those particular two groups. And that's really always been true for decades going back in the United States. All right, I'm going to skip over some material. Let me get to this point here. Sorry, there we go. Sorry for jumping around the slide series. This is a summary of the theory that my colleagues and my PhD students and others together with me have developed over the last 25 years or so. It's become an influential theory of suicide. It's not the only theory. It's not necessarily the best one or the perfect one. I'm not making any sort of claim like that. I am claiming that it's got some utility, that there's some scientific evidence behind it as well. Let me quickly walk you through the logic. It's pretty straightforward in some ways, and then apply some of these ideas to some particular topics of interest, and then we can go from there, perhaps transition to some question and answer. On the right side of the image, it says capacity for suicide, and in parentheses, it says fearlessness. The idea there is that suicide, death by suicide, is actually a shockingly daunting, difficult, fearsome thing to face and to enact. Of all the other things that you could say about death by suicide, it's very, very fearsome. In our cells and in our souls, we are afraid of death. It turns out we're also very afraid of killing. Suicide combines those two mortal terrors into one action. So of course, we're just very afraid and daunted by the prospect. And indeed, a number of people, quite a number of people on a daily basis desire their suicide, and they go through their entire plan for suicide, but they find at that last instant that they simply can't take the final step because it's too fearsome and too daunting. There are people, though, of course, we saw this at the outset of my presentation, there are a lot of people who do step over that threshold, so to speak. This theory suggests that what characterizes that group is that they have an unusual high capacity for suicide, that they're fearless about things like pain, fearless about injury, relatively unafraid about death itself, and they also know practical things. If the prospect is of firearm suicide, well, then they know how to operate a weapon, just as one example. Now, this capacity, in the context of suicide risk, it's dangerous and potentially tragic. If you take this capacity outside of the domain of mental health at all, and just think of it by itself, this capacity to be fearless, face up to hard things, hard physical things, it can actually be quite useful and even admirable. Think of firefighters or law enforcement officers or physicians or people in combat, our men and women in uniform. That type of capacity to do hard physical things is admirable and useful. But when it comes back into the mental health landscape and it's combined with these other things, that's when you have a dangerous combination that can result in a catastrophe. Let's talk about some of those other contextual factors, namely two of them, according to this theory: perceived burdensomeness and thwarted belongingness. These two ideas basically are interpersonal variables, social variables, based on the assumption that we're very social creatures. We have deeply social needs. And if those needs are thwarted or prevented from being satisfied, those have very pronounced mental health effects. We need to feel like we matter. We need to feel like we contribute. We need to feel like we're offering something to society or to loved ones or to family or to friends. And if we don't feel that way, we can end up feeling like a burden. If we feel like a burden, that can drive forward suicide risk, suicide ideas. Similarly, we need to feel connected. We need to feel like we're together. If we have that need thwarted, we can feel like we don't belong, like we're alienated, cut off, and lonely. When both states are present and when the person views those states as permanent, the theory predicts the desire for suicide will develop, but that the person cannot act on the desire unless the capacity for suicide is also present. So it's just this little group right in here in the middle where the two processes overlap that we see these catastrophic outcomes. That's the theory. I think you can see just from the logic of it that it's got some face validity. In other words, it makes sense. It's got clinical utility in the sense that if you know where people stand on these qualities, you have some sense of where they stand on risk. And it informs therapeutics in the sense that if you can target these things with therapeutics, the likelihood, at least according to the logic of this theory, is that you're going to thereby mitigate suicide risk. It's interesting to think of some of these ideas as applied to some occupational groups and some other groups who are at above average risk for suicide. Let me go back into my slide series to here. For example, in the US, here are a couple of the occupations that have especially high suicide rates. Mining and extraction, and also construction work. There are some others too. Forestry tends to have some high rates. Some healthcare workers have high rates too. And if you just kind of reflect on a commonality between mining and extraction, construction, forestry work, and work, say, as a physician, the commonality, there's a lot of differences between those occupations to be sure, but a commonality is that they have a day-to-day familiarity with what you might call physicality, physical things. The work is physical. In one way or another, to do the work, you have to be kind of unafraid of physical matters. Certainly physically demanding work like these two. Physicians, depends on the specialty, of course, but across specialties, having familiarity, comfort with the body, the prospect of pain and injury and the like certainly is kind of job requirement, at least vicariously seeing those things in patients, if not experiencing them oneself. The theory that I showed you a second ago kind of explains why that might be, why these rates might be high. These groups probably on average have an above average ability to die by suicide should they develop the desire to do so. Similarly, diagnostically, there's some evidence that of all the psychiatric syndromes lethal via suicide, there are many, there's some evidence that per capita, anorexia nervosa is the most lethal one of all. And from the same perspective of physicality, it's interesting to think about. This is a really bodily, really physically harsh condition or syndrome, maybe arguably one of the harshest of all. From the logic of that theory, it makes sense then that there would be high rates in this diagnostic group. Let's delve into that a little bit more here. Actually, let me get off of screen share for a second. I'll go back in a minute. Good on the technology, Mark and Mary Jo, everything?
Yep.
Okay,
Looks good. Thank you.
good. So I was talking about anorexia nervosa. I'll get back to the slide series in a second. But several years ago, some of my colleagues and I, we wondered, it might be that connection between anorexia nervosa and suicide death that might arise because of many different factors. And some of those are probably occurring to many of you. For instance, it might be that if you've been starving yourself for many years, sometimes decades, depending on the individual, well, you're likely to, that's going to affect you physically, make you physically frail, physically weaker than others. And then if you attempt suicide, even with a low lethality method, you might not be able to survive it because you're physically frail due to your anorexia. That's a plausible idea, and it could be driving that connection. We suspected, however, that the story was different and that it had more to do with physical fearlessness. The idea being that anorexia nervosa involves a lot of bodily ordeal, starvation, very harsh exercise regimens, purging behaviors, and the like. Kind of hard on the body. And so we reasoned that probably what's going on is fearlessness more than physical frailty. And further, we reasoned that if it is fearlessness, then the suicide methods in deaths by suicide among anorexic patients should be very high lethality on average, as opposed to low lethality deaths happening to cause death because the patient in question is physically frail due to the illness. Let me get back to the slide series and show you some evidence that supports that view. Where is that? Sorry.
And again, while Dr. Joyner is bringing up those slides for the next portion of today's presentation, I'll give him a moment to have a drink of water as well. Please enter your questions or comments into the Q&A, and we'll come back to those at the conclusion of Dr. Joyner's presentation. Thanks.
So we had a chance to arbitrate between these two views of, is it physical frailty or is it physical fearlessness that's driving this effect among 239 women with anorexia nervosa. We followed them for over 15 years, during which 9 died by suicide. And so we just asked the question, of these 9, were they high lethal methods versus not? And the bottom line is that these are very, very lethal deaths. This death is the least lethal method in the series of 9 deaths. And yet it's still quite lethal and quite violent. It involved the ingestion of an entire container of a household cleaning product that's extremely noxious and unsurvivable. Although this person was in the operating room and close to being rescued there, this is essentially an unsurvivable act. This is the least lethal method of the 9, leading us to conclude that our suspicion that really what's driving this is fearlessness about the body might be the more likely explanation. Incidentally, you can see there kind of at the bottom of this slide that right after ingesting that very powerful product, the next behavior engaged in by this individual was to call 911 to try to rescue herself. That's interesting to reflect on, in that in one moment, she was as committed to the idea of suicide as anyone, being able to do that act of ingestion of that product. And even in her, things turned. The self-preservation instinct reared up and had its day. Even in her, suggesting to me that it has its say in one way or another in almost everybody, even the most suicidal people, which is an interesting point to ponder. You can see there that our blood alcohol content is pretty substantial, twice the legal limit. Let me fast forward to some material on blood alcohol content, because that case is actually atypical with regard to blood alcohol content. This graph is just one particular study. You can see the details there at the top. People who either died by suicide, those are the black bars, or died by homicide, in other words, someone else killed them. Everybody in this study was killed by knife. Either they killed themselves with a knife or someone else killed them with a knife. Up and down axis is number of suicide or homicide decedents in each category. And then along the bottom is the amount of alcohol that they had in their system, ranging on the left from very little to on the right to quite a lot. 0.08%, which is our legal limit, is in the third category from the left. It corresponds to about 80 in this metric here. You can see that big black bar on the left side of the image. That's the bottom line here. Most suicide decedents don't have any alcohol in their system, or if they do, it's very little. Some have a lot, just like the anorexic patient that we talked about a moment ago. She would have been in that fifth category out there. Some patients do have that in their system, or decedents rather, have that much alcohol in their system, but very few. And then when you get out to the right, the far right of this image, there are no suicide decedents out there. Here's the way we view this slide. It's not that alcohol is not a risk factor for suicidal behavior. Alcohol misuse, sustained over the course of years or decades, is a risk factor. But even in that group, many of them decrease their intake previous to their suicides because they know that the alcohol will interfere with their plans. That fits this graphic pretty well. You might counter, well, this maybe doesn't generalize to the rest of the world. After all, this is a long time ago in Sweden, et cetera, et cetera. In response to that, we meta-analyzed this literature and in fact showed that it did generalize to the rest of the world, at least all the 90 plus studies that we could find on over 155,000 suicide decedents. Same exact pattern of finding in the larger study. So it's a general pattern. It is specific, this pattern, to suicide death. If we did a similar study with regard to non-lethal suicide attempt, I think we'd see the black bars shifting right. So this is about death. And it kind of makes sense given that theory that I showed you a little while ago, that to die by suicide, you need particular capacity to do that. And alcohol, if anything, is going to reduce that capacity. And so very determined people who are determined on their deaths, even if they're in the habit of drinking every day or every other day or whatever, they reduce their intake as part of their suicide plan, their lethal suicide plan as it happens. All right, so quick couple points about this idea. This is a proposal. Let me get everything up on the slide. This is a proposal for a new psychiatric syndrome that my colleagues and I have developed over the last several years, and it's called acute suicidal affective disturbance, or ASAD for short. And you can see the four main criteria there. Drastic increase in suicidal intent in the short term, acute increase in intent, specifically intent, not anything like ideas or whatever, just intent specifically. Feeling alienated from one's own self or others. The idea that this is all hopelessly intractable. And then elements of over-arousal, like agitation, irritability, insomnia, nightmares. We believe that this constitutes its own psychiatric condition because it occurs independent from other psychiatric conditions, with evidence to which I'll show you in a moment. But actually, it doesn't matter if you buy that or not, and it is actually a question mark as to whether that's true. This idea is useful clinically because this is either a disturbance or a disorder in and of itself, or it's a very useful way to track really serious, imminent suicide risk. High suicide risk basically means looking like this, looking like you have these criteria. I mentioned that I would defend the idea that this is independent of other psychiatric conditions. There's a lot here in this slide. You don't need to track all the details of what all the numbers mean and all that. Just look on the code to the right where you got the ASAD symptoms in red, the anxiety symptoms in blue, and the depression symptoms in tan or whatever that color is. Basically, this is just a quantified, it's called network analysis. It's a quantified way of tracking how cohesive a syndrome is with itself and whether it distinguishes itself from other neighboring conditions. And you can see that red neighborhood, that's the ASAD neighborhood, so to speak. That's very cohesive and tight, and it's non-overlapping with the blue, which is anxiety, and the tan, which is depression. Just recently, we figured, if we're going to really make the case for differentiation, what's the toughest case? And it's debatable, but we thought it might be borderline personality disorder because that condition has a lot of suicidality to it and a lot of other features. And indeed, the same kind of thing happens with regard to that differentiation. Here, the blue is ASAD, the orange is borderline personality disorder symptoms. It's not as tight in this particular study, the network, but it is distinct. These things differentiate from one another. Interestingly, the two borderline personality disorder symptoms that are the most distinct are out here. RIS stands for risk-taking. IMP stands for impulsivity. Those kinds of behaviors can be relevant to suicide risk, but distally, what's really dangerous on an imminent basis are things like these things in here, which is intent and self-hatred and things like that. I know this key over here is hopelessly small, so I won't expect you to read that. Closing and then turning to some questions. I did want to mention this effort, which I've been leading. I've been directing this effort for the DoD now for 10 years, together with my friend and colleague, Pete Gutierrez. This is a 10-year, $70 million DoD research effort, mostly geared towards developing interventions. And if you'd like more information about what those interventions are, what they involve, what the evidence is behind them, this website that I've got listed here, full of information. It's an FSU website, but this is about the larger DoD-funded effort. So just a reference there in case you're interested in any follow-up. Some of the articles and books that I've mentioned, at least in part, are summarized here. And then a reminder, here's my email address. We're gonna have question and answer right now, but if you think of something later, or you don't get a chance to ask me something, feel free. So I'm gonna stop sharing right there and then go over to where I can see at least Mary Jo and Mark and turn to the question and answer.
Great, thank you so much. Mary Jo, if it's okay, I can ask the questions that have come in and then turn to you if you have any as well. First question relates to just international experience. Someone asked that suicide hotlines have been reported in some other countries to be recently overwhelmed. What's the US experience and is that regional?
Yeah, I haven't tracked that very carefully. I have a little bit, but I don't want to convey that I'm, on top of every last data point there. But I don't know about U.S. resources, crisis resources being overwhelmed, but they definitely have seen an increase in use. And very similar to some of the increases in depression and anxiety rates in the population that I showed at the outset. That they've seen that too. Interestingly, one of the elements that drove down risk in the world, if you think back to the beginning where I showed the world rates going downward, there's a whole number of elements that are responsible for that. But one of the elements is that countries are more and more starting to ramp up their crisis resources. So that appears to be a contributor to that. It's a credit, I think, to crisis care and how it can be, if it's caring and if it's knowledgeable, which in the US, I think it quite largely is, it can be very much to the public good, to the public health.
And follow up to that, just a question for me, in the midst of super challenging times, obviously, and increasing reports of, these self-reports of depressive symptoms and anxiety and perhaps suicidality in young adults, is this an opportunity for us as a country to uplift our focus and our resource development related to mental health and well-being?
I think there's something to that. I think it may well be an opportunity. I can just give you one local example where Florida State rolled out just within the last day or two a mandatory training activity for all faculty and all staff that have any contact whatsoever with students. Basically what amounts to a suicide, risk, sort of tutorial and mental health literacy type thing. The idea is not to deputize faculty and staff as mental health professionals. That's not the idea. The idea rather is to educate faculty and staff, all of them, about the resources that are available. And if you see a student who's struggling or who needs them, be a liaison between the classroom, let's say, or the Zoom meeting, what have you, and mental health resources. That's just an example of something that is, it's mandatory, which, to tell you the truth, I'm not that big a fan of, honestly, but it shows you the seriousness with which the leadership is taking it and rolling it out across the entire faculty and staff. It's an interesting example. That's just one local example of, I'm sure, dozens or hundreds across the country.
And Mary Jo, the NARB Institute's been a leader in one of the leaders in Arizona of encouraging and supporting mental health first aid training for people from all perspectives, just to try to have that complementary, just basic training and understanding of mental health challenges that sometimes people have for physical health.
Right, absolutely. We've seen that goes a long way. Sometimes it's just information. Sometimes it really has led to some recovery. Absolutely. Thomas, very interested in maybe, we can do further conversations offline or another community grand rounds on the acute suicide affective disturbance. Because as we go through this current storm and then what we expect to be a transformation in some ways in terms of everything all the way from telemed to treatment, I think this is something that is certainly not familiar to me. It may be much more familiar to the physicians or the clinicians on the phone, but I think that's an area that bears more information and knowledge. I think the other thing, are you seeing anything relative to changes now with telemedicine? You mentioned it a little bit earlier about people being more willing to engage, less stigma, those kind of things. And in so doing that, do you see a trajectory to some of the suicide work that you're doing?
Yes, I mean, our clinic, again, I recognize it's merely a local example of hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands, but I'm familiar with it and I do think it's reasonably representative. That clinic's director, namely me, was not a fan of things like Zoom, at all. And now 6 months later, not only me, but certainly these PhD students who are already very, fluent with these kinds of media, and our patients who are not, you might think, oh, it's a psychotherapy clinic on a state university campus, must be like a counseling center. No, ours is for the region, North Florida, South Georgia. These are community people, many of whom are just like me. I'm actually from Georgia, and same age, same cultural background. They don't want to deal with Zoom and such, was their attitude 6 months ago. And yet it just has turned around and been seamless. And to your point, Mary Jo, many of them, almost all, have expressed surprise and kind of pleasure about how well it's gone and the many advantages of navigating obstacles like parking and childcare and things of that sort. Now, there is another obstacle for some people of internet access, and that can't be overlooked. But on balance, we've really been pleasantly surprised at how this has made the process better. We've noticed no drop off. A lot of psychotherapists are understandably worried about a drop off in being there empathically present with their patients and not working out over Zoom. We've seen no change in that. The technology is such that it can pick up on virtually all of that. So we've been pleasantly surprised as our bottom line. And I think that's been a kind of pretty general reaction.
Great, thank you. If it's interesting, in 1998, I think it was, I had a psychiatrist who was at the vanguard of telepsychiatry in this country. When I asked him, how is telepsychiatry different, and what's the best way to approach it, his answer to me was, it's simple. Create relationship with someone just like you would if you're on the phone or they're in front of you. And if you can do that, there's a lot that you're able to accomplish. Have you learned, or is it too early to say, particular aspects of suicidal assessment via telemedicine that the past 6 months have given you insight to?
I mean, I don't think they're any less valid, and I would say they're equally valid, and possibly, arguably, maybe slightly more valid on telehealth, just because you have people in their natural environments, so to speak. Their guard is different, than it is in a clinic. You might even actually be able to observe something dangerous. This is rare, but it's possible to observe something dangerous in the natural environment that can be a suicide, method potentially. And then if that's observed, then the crucial, activity of means safety is what it's called, just making things that are dangerous less dangerous, so that someone who is at risk has more, space and distance between themselves and the potentially dangerous object. So I would argue, if anything, that the risk assessment process is slightly more valid, if anything.
Thank you. There was another question around the networking graph that you showed in relation to ASAD and how it was distinct from depression and anxiety. But someone chatted in a question, wouldn't there be some overlap because some aspects do have some connectivity? Is it because the characteristics you've identified are so distinct?
It's a good question, because there definitely is overlap. And moreover, what you do see actually more frequently than you would see an ASAD clinical presentation, what you would see is an exacerbation, a suicidal exacerbation of an existing condition like major depressive disorder. That's actually pretty common. And what we're claiming is that ASAD is not merely that exists, that accounts for a number of suicides, and that ASAD is differentiable from that, distinguishable from that. It's an arguable and debatable claim for sure. And it's an interesting one too, because it really, passions get they run pretty high about that. I think it's because it's maybe the question of a new diagnosis. I think that's maybe what gets people's emotion running high for. I don't really see why that would be, but I've noticed that it does spur people to get passionate one way or another. I've just noticed it, especially consulting on legal cases where someone had a non-mood psychiatric condition that was pretty well controlled, and there was no depression, for example, and the primary condition of, say, schizophrenia in one case or anorexia nervosa in another case was pretty well controlled. And then within hours of being released from a hospital, suicidality spiked, seemingly independent of that primary condition and independent of any depression. It seemed to be a thing of its own, and it resulted in death in both those cases. And I've seen some other cases like that too, in consulting and clinically. So I'm a believer that this is a unique, independent reality of a psychiatric condition and deserves to be characterized in the nosology, like things like DSM. But I also am a realist and understand not everybody's going to agree with that. It's an interesting debate at any rate.
Is there a particular research instrument that you use? And I think the questioner was probably wondering, that is available outside the research,
Yeah,
or is that
absolutely.
within the confines?
Absolutely. I mean, we've to measure ASAD, we have developed an instrument to do that. If you just go into Google Scholar and search for my last name, which is Joyner, Joiner, and if you also search acute suicidal affective disturbance, what'll come up are probably at this point something like at least a half dozen papers, in most of which we use that instrument. And then we can just send you that instrument if you email me. And we have similar instruments, by the way, that measure each of the aspects of the theory that I mentioned, like capacity for suicide, thwarted belongingness, perceived burdensomeness. Those things are easy to measure. Across the board, we've taken seriously the psychologist's code of we give psychology away. In other words, we're not charging any money for any of this. It's freeware. So that's the other thing, that other question that sometimes comes up.
Well, great. Thank you so much. I think that's all the time we have questions for today. I'll turn it back to Mary Jo, but with a final thank you to Dr. Joyner for a really important presentation, and thank you especially for the work that you're doing. Mary Jo?
Yeah, I would agree. Thank you very much to everybody that took the time out today to join on this very, very important subject and topic. And Thomas, thank you very much for your generosity of time and spirit to share. You have a wonderful approach to this very scary and alarming situation, even exacerbated now by the impact of the pandemic. And while we appreciate all of the important clinical issues that you presented, I am at least very grateful for the ports in the storm that you mentioned, and your ability to take the research and clarity down to those of us that do not work every single day in this area. So thank you very much, and we hope to be able to continue this dialogue into the future.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Mary Jo. Thank all of you for listening in. Happy to continue the dialogue going forward.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you much.
Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.